Pastor Ed here with our weekly devotion, the week of Lent 1, or the first Sunday of Lent. The gospel reading, of course, on Sunday was John 11, verses 1 through 44. Rather long one once again, the story of the raising of Lazarus. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask that if you'd like to maybe reread that first and then listen to today's devotion. Again, the story about the raising of Lazarus. Well, there was once a middle-aged woman who had a heart attack and went to the hospital. They had to do bypass surgery, and while she was on the operating table, she had one of those near-death experiences. She saw a long tunnel with a bright light at the end of it, and the light spoke, and she realized that it was God. And so she asked God if she was going to die, if her time was up, and God answered her and said, "No, you have another 43 years, 2 months, and 8 days to live." Well, the next thing she knew, she woke up in the recovery room, trusting that she had that much longer to live now, and wanting to make the very best of her remaining years on this earth. When she had fully recovered from the heart surgery, she immediately went to see a plastic surgeon. She got a nose job, a facelift, breast augmentation, liposuction, and a tummy tuck. In other words, she had the plastic surgeon unsag all the sagging places, tighten up all the loose places, and enhance all of the enhanceable places. And when she had recovered from all of that, she next went to see the best cosmetologist in town. She got her hair cut and dyed, her new face made up, her new body tanned, and her nails done. After everything was coated, painted, dried, she then left the beauty shop. And while walking happily out the door, she started to cross the street and immediately was run over by a city bus and killed. Arriving in heaven, she angrily approached God. "I thought you said I had another 43 plus years left." And God looked at her and squinted and said, "Oh, that was you? I didn't recognize who it was." Now, none of this never really happened, of course, but as you could probably know, there actually is evidence, anecdotal at least, of people having so-called near-death experiences. They are commonly referred to as NDE for short. And the definition of a near-death experience is this: a phenomenon reported by people who return to life after being declared clinically dead. Now, some people apparently experience a negative NDE, in which the process of dying is actually quite frightening. They report visiting dark places, encountering demonic beings, and experiencing rather intense feelings of grief, depression, and fear. One of the most vivid portrayals of this type of NDE was depicted in the Patrick Swayze Demi Moore movie Ghost years ago, where you may recall evildoers were literally pulled into the bowels of the earth by the devil's minions. According to some researchers, about 15% of adults, but only 3% of children have this type of negative NDE. And then there's the more common and positive near-death experience with the bright lights at the end of a long tunnel. Many who claim such an experience later report the sensation of being enveloped by love and peace and joy, and sometimes talk about meeting a deceased friend or relative who either takes them through the tunnel or greets them at the tunnel's end. Still others encounter religious figures, but always corresponding to their personal belief system. In other words, Christians don't see Hindu religious figures, and Hindus don't encounter Christ. Not surprisingly, some of the most famous near-death experiences have been reported by celebrities. For instance, actress Jane Seymour, who played Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman on TV, once had a near-death experience after a severe allergic reaction to penicillin. "I literally left my body," she says. "I had the feeling that I could see myself on the bed with people around me, all trying to resuscitate me." And the late actor Larry Hagman, TV's famous J.R. Ewing on Dallas, had a near-death experience at the time of his liver transplant back in 1995. "I was able to look over the edge," he says. "I got a glimpse of what was the next step. I didn't see a light some people see, but I had this wonderful feeling of bliss and warmth. The bottom line is love." That sounds corny, he said, but it was just lovely, uplifting. Of course, many medical experts tend to debunk near-death experiences and try to explain them away as merely the neurological actions of the brain when the body's systems begin to shut down as death approaches. And when the individual is somehow revived or resuscitated, they say it's a little like rebooting a computer. But here's the thing, it doesn't really matter, because this week's gospel reading about the raising of Lazarus is nothing like what I've just been describing for you. Nothing at all. In other words, this is not an account of a near-death experience. If you want to be perfectly clear and technical about it, the story of Lazarus is the story of a total death experience. In other words, Lazarus was not revived or brought back from the precipice of death and the great unknown. No, Lazarus was actually dead and gone by the time that Jesus finally showed up. He was belly up, as they say. He had bit the dust, bought the farm. He was deader than a doornail. He had flatlined, got stamped, returned to sender, kicked the oxygen habit, was pushing up daisies and sleeping with the fishes, and had even yielded up the ghost. Feel free, of course, to insert the euphemism of your choice here. The point is that this is not just another healing like the ones we've seen previously. This is not like the healing of the royal official's son, or the lame man, or the man born blind. Lazarus, Jesus' good friend Lazarus, was beyond all that, far beyond. As our reading this today opens, word is sent from Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, that their brother was ill. But this is where it gets interesting, and where today's reading departs from all the previous ones, all the previous signs, especially those aforementioned healings. Unlike them, you see, this is not just a chance encounter or unexpected set of circumstances. In other words, it's not like the turning of the water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana, where Jesus just happened to be a guest. Nor is it like all the previous healings where Jesus had just happened to encounter the royal official when he returned to Cana, or just happened to spot the lame man lying by that pool in Jerusalem, or just happened to see the man blind from birth as he walked along. No, in this instance, in this case, Jesus is being personally summoned. Nor is this a stranger that Jesus is being summoned to help here either. It's not some random and anonymous individual like the royal official's son or the paralytic or the blind man. No, this is a friend, a good friend, in fact. Dare we say, a very good friend, apparently, which makes what happened next all the more curious, if not disturbing. You remember, for example, in all those previous instances that we've just named, how easy it was for people to get Jesus's attention, or for him to zero in on their situation, and then how quickly he responded to their need. Here, however, Jesus replies somewhat enigmatically to the news of Lazarus' illness by saying this illness does not lead to death. In other words, he kind of brushes it off at first, doesn't he? He downplays the seriousness and the significance of this message that he's just received from Mary and Martha. His reaction is somewhat indifferent at best. So much so, apparently, that we're told, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after hearing that Lazarus was ill, he got up and left immediately? No. Quickly attended to the matters at hand and then left within the hour? No. Got a good night's rest and departed first thing in the morning? Nope. What he did was this, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was, says John. And then 48 hours later, Jesus matter-of-factly says to the disciples, almost out of the blue, okay, let's go to Judea again. They have to understand something here, something that was skipped over in the passages that we heard in the narrative lectionary over the past few weeks. And that is right before this, in chapter 10, Jesus' enemies, while he was in Judea, took up stones to kill him. They also tried, we're told, to arrest him. But Jesus somehow escaped and crossed over the Jordan to the wilderness area where John the Baptist had earlier been preaching. However, now he's willing to come back over to Judea, apparently. Why the delay, the reluctance? At first glance, it might seem that Jesus was perhaps afraid to go back initially, even to help his good friend Lazarus, because of these death threats and plots against him. But then a couple of days later, he simply reconsidered. Perhaps that's certainly one logical possibility. As it turns out, as plausible as that scenario may sound, that was not the case, however. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, said Jesus, but I am going there to awaken him. There are those euphemisms again. Kick the bucket, fallen asleep. There's a million of them. And the disciples respond, Lord, if he's just fallen asleep, then he'll be all right, won't he? Jesus, however, had been speaking about Lazarus' death, we're told. But the disciples, of course, had thought that Jesus was merely referring to actual sleep, says John. So Jesus plainly tells them, no, Lazarus is dead. But then there's another mysterious statement. For your sake, he said, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. And then he announced, let's go to him. And it's at this point, one of the disciples, Thomas, who's still obviously very much concerned about all those earlier plots and threats against Jesus as well, then let's all go with him that we may die with him. And so finally they set out for Bethany and for the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. By the time Jesus arrived, we're told Lazarus had now been dead and in the tomb for 4 days, or 96 hours in all. This means, of course, that now there's absolutely no doubt about what has happened, if there had indeed been any doubts before. In other words, Lazarus is not merely deathly sick or at the point of death, as we heard in the case of that royal official's son. No, there's absolutely no question about it. As the coroner in the Wizard of Oz proclaimed regarding the Wicked Witch of the East who had been flattened by Dorothy's house, as coroner, I thoroughly examined her, and she's not only merely dead, she's really most sincerely dead. Likewise, here, Lazarus is not just merely dead, but he too is most sincerely dead, making all that happens next not a near-death experience, but in reality, as I said earlier, a total death experience. There's even a little twist here, a little Bible trivia, if you will, that makes this all the more understandable and interesting. You see, a popular belief in Jesus' day was that the soul lingered near the body of the deceased for 3 days and then left, presumably at that point, forever. In other words, for 72 hours, at least according to popular belief in that day, there was still a chance that the deceased might be resuscitated. Beyond 3 days, however, and that window of opportunity would have clearly come and gone. And thus the significance of Jesus waiting like he did and arriving 96 hours later, or a full day after the soul had presumably left the body, was that now there was absolutely no question that Lazarus was long gone and that there was no longer any hope whatsoever that he was ever coming back. Which then begs the question, did Jesus do this, arrive 4 days late like this, intentionally? Because if he did, then that earlier statement, for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, that you may believe, begins to make a lot more sense, doesn't it? And once again, just like before, what we see about to unfold is a sign pointing to Jesus' true identity and to his glory. As Jesus now approaches, Martha, hearing that Jesus was coming, goes out to meet him, leaving Mary at home. And when she finally reaches him, she says exactly what we would have expected her to say. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If only you had been here. Implying if only you would come when we sent for you, if only you would come right away like a good friend would have, then this might not have happened. And yet this, of course, is where Jesus informs her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And shortly thereafter, Mary too comes out to meet Jesus, and not surprisingly, she too, just like her sister, says, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. And she even kneels at his feet, weeping as she says this. In other words, why did you take your time? Just like her sister, she's wondering out loud, didn't you see, didn't you appreciate just how serious the situation was? I can still remember when I had my heart attack nearly 18 years ago. Since it was a Friday night, once they stopped it in its tracks with nitroglycerin and stabilized me for a moment, they just then sort of let me hang out for the rest of the weekend, transferring me over to a different hospital on Saturday afternoon with the idea of doing a heart catheterization first thing Monday morning. In other words, the blockages were still there, and so the chance of a potentially damaging or even fatal heart attack at any moment was still present, but they more or less just put me on ice for the weekend. Now, I was being monitored all the time, of course, except when they had a power outage Sunday night, and then both backup generators failed as well. Talk about scary. But nevertheless, I can remember thinking to myself, especially as my condition began to deteriorate further over the course of the weekend, that I wish they would hurry up and do something. It got so bad Sunday night, for instance, that even making the slightest movement as I laid there in the hospital bed sent my heart racing and my chest pounding. And I remember lying there wide awake all night long, just counting down the minutes until morning when they would finally go up inside my heart arteries to see what exactly was going on, and thinking all that time, hurry up, doc, hurry up. Well, same thing here. They sent for Jesus, and what does he do? He takes his own sweet time, doesn't he? So much so that when he finally does get there, Lazarus is dead and gone, and in the tomb 4 days already. How disappointed Mary and Martha must have been, how callous Jesus must have seemed to them at that moment in their grief. Their good friend Jesus, who they always thought was their very good friend, had completely and utterly let them down, hadn't he? How disillusioned they must have felt at that point, disillusioned with him in particular. And then we even have another curious moment. That is, when Jesus saw her weeping and the friends who had gone out with her to greet him also weeping, Jesus, says John, was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And yet up until now, of course, for these entire 4 days, in fact, when you think about it, we didn't hear anything at all about how Jesus was feeling, did we? Not a peep. Which is also kind of strange when you stop and think about it. Here's someone that Jesus supposedly loved, a really good and close friend, and not even a single tear before now. And it's only when he sees others crying that finally he too begins to show some emotion. He asks simply, "Where have you laid him?" They answered, "Lord, come and see." Then and only then does Jesus allow himself to break down and cry. As Scott Hosey asks, so what made Jesus cry? Hosey's answer, it was Jesus seeing everyone else crying. It was not just Lazarus' death that got to him, said Hosey, but the tragedy of the larger human condition. Think about it. Jesus undoubtedly knew going in that Lazarus' death would not be the final word here. And that's why he's not too distressed at first either. He knew what he could and would do for his friend. And he fully intended to do it as well, even waiting apparently those 4 days, not for dramatic effect as it turns out, but rather to ensure that everyone who witnessed it would be able to see and understand the raising of Lazarus for what it really was, a sign pointing not only to Jesus' true identity, but a sign that pointed also to the promise of new life in his name. The compassion of Jesus' heart, writes Scott Hosey, moves him to tears, but throughout his ministry, Hosey adds, that same compassion moved Jesus to love all people and to want to help. It reminds me of a story I once heard about a young boy. He was sent by his mother to the corner store to buy a loaf of bread, but he was gone, however, much longer than it should have taken him. And so when he finally returned, his mother asked him, "Where have you been? I've been worried sick about you." Well, he answered, "There was this little boy with a broken tricycle who was crying, so I stopped to help him." And the mom said, "I didn't know you could fix tricycles." And the little boy said, "I can't. I just stood there and cried with him." And then Scott Hosey sums it up perfectly when he writes, "The Son of God who wept when he saw others weeping, who was moved to tears when one of his friends died, came to this world precisely because he so desperately wanted to help, wanted to do something which would begin to dry every tear from every person's eyes. But Jesus knew," he notes, "that even as death awaited him, so we would all die, just as surely as Lazarus had died and would die again. The trick," says Hosey, "was to turn the tables on death, to turn it into a portal to life instead of the end of everything. That trick, if you could or even should call it that, would have to wait until Easter morning, however, but for now, we have a glimpse, a snapshot, if you will, of what is to come. And so when Jesus arrived at the tomb, a cave really, and saw the stone that was lying against the entrance, he said, 'Take away the stone,' even over the protests of Martha, who warned him of the stench of a 4-day-old body, that 4-day-old dead body that awaited them, since Jewish burial practices did not include any sort of embalming. And then after praying to his Father, Jesus cried with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' And the dead man, the one who had a total death experience, came out, his hands and feet wrapped in cloths, and his face as well. And then Jesus said, 'Unbind him and let him go.' And it was so." Everything up until now, those previous signs we've looked at have been pretty impressive, to say the least. But this most recent one really takes the cake, if you ask me. It demonstrated that not only did Jesus have power over nature and disease and illness, but he even had power over death itself. In other words, he was someone to be reckoned with. And as we shall see, it probably sealed his own fate ultimately as well. But the point was made. Jesus, not death, would have the final word. Some years ago, perhaps you recall the incident, a huge section of an airliner suddenly tore off during a flight over in Hawaii. And afterwards, the passengers who had survived this frightening ordeal, not a true death experience, near-death experience perhaps, but certainly close to one, were interviewed by a TV reporter. And while some felt guilty to be alive, others said they felt that life was now more precious to them, that they had chosen to live totally in the present and not to worry so much about the future. One even reported that she now found herself treating her daughter differently. Whereas before the incident, she had been awfully hard on her daughter, demanding that the 15-year-old clean up, fix up, shape up. Now she would catch herself thinking, wait a minute, that maybe it's not so important. Just love her. Just take joy in her. And as for the pilot of that plane, who was credited with landing it safely, he's now retired from flying, says that he goes out on the deck of his home every morning, a little surprised to find himself alive and thanking the Lord for the privilege of another day. One certainly gets the sense that Lazarus felt very much the same way too, as do many who have had one of those so-called near-death experiences as well. A new appreciation for and a new lease on that precious gift of life. And I think that's exactly the reason why John chose to tell us the story of Lazarus in the first place, even though his was not a near death, but a total death experience. It was so that we too could have a new appreciation for life, so that we too could be set free from the fear of death. Personally, I've been fortunate enough, at least that's the way I look at it, to have cheated death twice. The first time when I had meningitis and encephalitis, I spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital, lost over 50 pounds, approximately 20% of my body weight at the time. Best weight loss program I've ever experienced, by the way. And the second time was when I had my aforementioned heart attack, which required not one but 2 catheterizations 3 days apart and a total of 4 stents inserted into my heart arteries. Needless to say, everything since then, it seems to me, has been, as they say, all gravy. Well, I think that's how the gospel writer wants us all to look at life, from Lazarus's perspective and from the perspective of Easter morning. That Jesus, not death, has the final word, that life in Christ is all good, all gravy. Speaking of near-death experiences, someone once said life itself is a near-death experience. In other words, one day we are all going to have to face the prospect and reality of death. But again, because of Jesus, death is now simply the door to a new and greater life with God.